thank you for giving us your attention. Gary, thank you so much for kicking us off in such a, I think, invigorating way, talking so honestly about what it takes to create company culture. I think we're really privileged to hear from you, and thank you very much for being at our forum. And Gary set a great stage for us, and I think because the privilege continues to be able to have these leaders from our global development sector up here this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming them. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, "If you're going to change things, you have to be with the people who hold the levers." And up here, we have 5 executive leaders in the global development sector who indeed hold the levers. So we're going to have a really, I think, interesting and honest conversation about the kinds of cultures that we're looking to build in our organizations. So I'd love to start, Debbie, if you can share with us, what brings you to this work?
All right, thank you. So I'm not going to introduce myself. I'm going to tell you a story about why women's leadership is so important to me. So I had actually been at USAID for about 8 years, and I had been one of 12 staff that was very fortunate to have benefited from an upward mobility program. I was moving from a secretarial role into a professional role while I was going to school. So it was in the mid-'80s, and I remember to this day vividly a woman who was in the Foreign Service, she was in her late 40s, was just ranting about how she felt that the Foreign Service life had stolen her happiness. And she felt that she had had to make so many choices, that she didn't have a partner in life, and she was very bitter. And I'm at that moment in my life when I'm thinking, I really want to go overseas. I really want to be a Foreign Service officer. And I just thought it had to be different. 25 years later, I went into the Foreign Service. She didn't stop me. I had a wonderful life. I have a husband. I have a family. Had a wonderful career. And 25 years later, I was at the head of USAID's Human Resource Office. And I used to make a trip at least once a month to Charlottesville, where we ran our Leadership at All Levels program. And 25 years later, that was still first and foremost on many people's mind. What sacrifices as a woman do I have to make to be able to make it? Will I have to leave my role, my job, in order to make family and work-life balance? And so that just led me in everything I do to be convinced that my responsibility was to help people and women particularly, to find their voice. You know, not everybody's journey in leadership has to be the same way or the way it's always done. So that's what's motivating me.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm just curious, what Debbie just shared, just raise your hand if any of what she shared resonated with you, either on part of the juggle that you're doing or advice you took or didn't take. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks a lot for kicking us off, Debbie. Sylvia, what brings you to this work?
First of all, I want to just thank you for being here. I'm not going to introduce myself also. I'd also want to do a particular shout out for our male colleagues who are here with us today, because I think your role in all of this is really very important. So. Along those lines, I've had the privilege to have many sponsors who have helped me in my career, who have helped me recognize things I could have done differently, things I could have done better, or things that I did do well. But I remember one of the most respected individuals in one of my previous organizations, where I worked for 15 years, told me something nice once. And I really remember it. But I thought, wow, that's a long time. But elsewhere in my career, I've really had a lot of people who have helped take care of me. And what's interesting is sometimes those people knew that they were my mentors, but sometimes I sought them out. And I remember one person used to have coffee with very senior in the industry maybe every 3 times a year maybe. And after about 4 years, I called him when I was having a crisis. And he said, meet me at 7:30 in the morning tomorrow for coffee. And I said, did you know that you've been my mentor for the last 4 years? And I can't believe, thank you for helping me work through this challenge. So I feel an immense responsibility, but an enormous amount of energy out of helping others. I grew up in an organization where I was one of the first, nobody in leadership had children. Nobody. I had no woman or man who could help me understand how to be both a parent and an executive. And so that was very important to me along my career, working with young women and men who are trying to build a whole life, not just a partial life. So I really feel a deep responsibility. I get a lot of energy out of it, and I also just want to give back.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sylvia. Samit, what brings you to this panel? What's in your personal story we should know?
Great. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So thank you for the question, Fiona, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today. Meaningful and important conversation that we're having as part of this panel, as well as the sessions like throughout the day. What brings me to this work, my reasons are professional, but also certainly, very personal. I serve what's viewed as a very institutional role for Save the Children. So I'm the general counsel here, and in organizations, the general counsel is viewed as often just the sole focus, or the couple of focuses are really looking at reputational risk and legal liability. I've always viewed it differently. I've always viewed it that if you do the right thing, if you do right by the individuals in the organization, then that goes a really long way to all the other stuff working itself out positively. So, I've taken that approach both as first in my career as a lawyer, then as a manager of staff, and then now as part of a management team. What I would say, is that also by taking that approach, I feel it's practical, but it also leads to, a positive, uplifting, and ethical culture in the organization. So I've always had that point of view throughout my career, but then it really became kind of supercharged. I took that approach I felt even exponentially stronger about it over the course of the last couple of years. So first of all, professionally, over the last couple of years in our organization, things have come to light where it was clear that we didn't have a culture that prevented harassment and bullying. There were historic incidents that came to light, as well as management's responses to these incidents, which certainly, were not handled as appropriately as they could. And so, in looking at these, I realized that I needed to be part of the solution. And we had numerous conversations with staff. We had a workplace culture survey, focus group sessions, and some very concerning things came out of those conversations. Some of the things that came out were that junior staff members, particularly female staff members, felt that they had been treated inappropriately at some time during their experience in the office. Other populations had indicated, or actually across the population, several staff members indicated that they had experienced microaggressions, either one-off basis or consistently, and that affected some populations more significantly than others. For example, our LGBT population. And then just, more generally, people said that they didn't have space, for their voice to be heard. So I very much want to be part of the solution there. And realizing that it was, a concerning issue within our organization. At the same time, personally, 3 years ago, I started my journey as a parent of a child with disability. I'm very fortunate to be a father of 3 children, and my middle child, my son, has Down syndrome. And so I'm very early in my journey as a parent, supporting a child with a disability. But it made me think not just about his current level of inclusion and his future level of inclusion in life activities, but it just makes me think more broadly, about those who have disabilities or certain diversity characteristics where they're not included as fully as they can be. So I think about this professionally and personally, and then professionally, I'm very much part of a team that's working on our policies and our procedures and our workplace culture in the organization. But I really wanted to take it beyond that, and so that's why I really think it's important to build a culture that really lets people be themselves, their full selves, at the office, and gives them space for them to share their perspective and for their voices to be heard, which is why I chose to join our Diversity and Inclusion Council at the organization, which I'll talk about in a little bit.
Okay, Fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that, Bonnie. I'm delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. And okay, I think there's like a time delay for the microphones. So great. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you so much for having heat in this building, because it feels like we're in the middle of winter in Washington. And when I was trying to figure out what do you wear to a wild women's event, I realized I wear wool because it's so cold. But thank you for having me here today. I was thinking as I was listening to you guys here on stage that an important word that you've probably all been hearing today is the word mentor. And I think that all of us have benefited on this stage, and certainly many of you in the audience as well, from having great mentors all along the way in our careers. When I transitioned from the State Department to IBM, which are two completely different universes, my boss in IBM said to me, I hired you because you're a square peg for a round hole that we have here, and we need people to think differently. You don't come from a technical background, but you bring strengths that overall will make IBM a better corporation. Wow, that was really sort of humbling, because what was I going to do to change Big Blue? And I'm not saying that I did anything to change one of the world's largest and process-focused organizations. What I learned there were probably the most important lessons for my development professionally. And one of the things was 3 weeks into my job, she said to me, "Give me your resume." And I said, well, I have to update it to show this time that I'm at IBM. And she said, you should always have an updated resume. And it wasn't her way of inching me out the door. It was her way of saying to me, it's important in life to always keep your eyes open to opportunities. Both the State Department and IBM were amazing places for me to try different things. As a Foreign Service officer, it's built in. You change jobs every couple of years because you're moving from one country to another, or you're changing jobs within Washington, D.C. In IBM, the culture there too is to try different things. During the course of all of this, I bore and raised two amazing young men, and I say the same things to them all the time. It's never a good idea to close your eyes to opportunities, because you never know when those opportunities are going to knock again. I look at all of you in the room here today, and I just think about all of the opportunities that will be coming your way, and it's so exciting to think about those possibilities. I encourage all of you to take advantage of mentors. That first boss of mine at IBM is one of my closest and dearest friends, and she taught me so much during my time there. I have had many, many mentors. They've been men and women who have been extraordinary guiding forces in my career, who have just helped me see that there's opportunity around the corner, and you just have to look at it and visualize yourself in it. It's a great place to be. So I look forward to hearing about your opportunities as well.
Great. Thanks very much, Bonnie. Catherine, please tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Fiona. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Let me just check. I think your mic.
Oh, I turned it off.
Yeah.
I think it's on.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Can you all hear me? All right. Okay. Better. It's such an exciting opportunity to learn from one another and share experiences. In my role at Chemonics, I oversee our gender equality and social inclusion technical practice. And in that role, and through my personal experiences, I've come to reinforce that in order to facilitate women's empowerment, I think we need to recognize that we're not all the same. We have different needs and experiences, different identities that impact our own experience. And for me, as a young woman of color, time and time again, I have received subtle and sometimes not so subtle messages that have forced me to question, my sense of belonging as a leader. Whether that was as the deputy chief of party of a $100 million project, meeting with our client and being mistaken for the chief of party's administrative assistant, or conducting an oversight visit in a field office, working with an older male COP who would make jokes to the entire field team about me being his boss, or meeting with mission colleagues to discuss the portfolio I oversee and have them make comments about how young I seem for the role. And while I would hope that these are the types of experiences that are the exception, from speaking with colleagues, I know that many people face these types of experiences and confront these challenges on a day-to-day basis. So for me, when thinking about sort of diversity and leadership, I think the challenge and opportunity comes in how do we foster that sense of belonging, create a culture of authenticity where we don't feel like we're necessarily adhering to a norm that's not allowing us to embrace our diversity, but instead we're creating the space for women to kind of be their authentic selves and bring sort of different perspectives and voices to the table unapologetically.
Wow. Well, hearing everybody's story and what brings people into these chairs and being interested in being on this panel, I find it very inspiring. And whatever the kind of past history of organizations and experiences have been, I have to say, like, the future looks very exciting. And what I'd love to do now is to kind of hear about some of the levers or some of the levers, depending where in North America you're from. You are pulling in order to create the kinds of cultures of inclusive leadership, which clearly you all have your eye on and you're such a big part of creating. And it sounds as though your visions are even bolder than where you are at the moment. So one of our themes of this forum is really, and I spoke about it this morning, was about the journey of inclusive leadership. And I think part of what that connotes is that the journey is very important, that people are in different places, and that we are moving forward. And I want to emphasize that because we do want to cultivate this, I think, spirit of openness in the discussions that we have. And one of the reasons I really feel privileged that we have all of these speakers, these leaders on the stage, is because of their comfort in talking about the openness of the journey that they're on and not having it all figured out or having it all perfect. And I guess I really invite you to kind of, along with me, just really like sort of support them and acknowledge that that's not always easy. So it's a very special group of people. So Debbie, I'd love to start with you, for you to kind of tell us about part of like the journey of inclusive leadership that you're leading at FHI 360. And I've asked each of the panelists to take time to really go into those stories so that we can really understand this part of the journey that they're going to talk about, with the goal that there's things that each of us can take away and think about how we can apply in our own work, in our own journeys. So Debbie.
Right, thank you. And I should note that a number of us on the panel commented that following Gary, when you have employee engagement numbers like that, and then being so humble as to say, I'm still learning and I'm still welcoming all of that love, it was just a little bit daunting. I have a lot more learning than Gary needs. And here at FHI 360, so let me just start about building the culture that we want. I think we all, in the international development field, we really understand that we have ambitious goals, and how we act and how we operate is as important to what we're able to accomplish. It's more important perhaps than in other places. And so we really have to walk the talk. And so to build an organizational culture of inclusion and diversity, it's not something where there is a silver bullet. It's a combination of leadership commitment and practice, so walking the talk, initiatives taken, and then very important part about the employee engagement and the feedback that they give us as we go along that journey. At FHI 360, we have a diversity and inclusion strategy that has 3 pillars. We've invested in leadership training for our most senior managers. Some have attended the Center for Creative Leadership and Learning. We have a growing suite of professional development opportunities and many other efforts. But today, to spend some time on one, I wanted to focus on our use and the role of affinity groups, or as we call them at FHI 360, employee resource groups, and where I see them as being important to our organizational's diversity and inclusive culture. First, let me note that our workplace ERGs have evolved. So our ERGs might talk about building the kinds of tribes that we want. Right now, we have more than a dozen groups. They range from the Parents Network, veterans groups, groups organized around regional culture, and then our very active women's ERG. And the women's ERG, it was interesting, my human resources director reflected that when we started the resource groups, we didn't have a women's ERG. We had a little professional women's leadership council. But then from the employees, they wanted to form, and so a lot of our employee resource groups are the result of employees taking the initiative to say, hey, this kind of support group would help me feel like I belong and learn. And the women's ERG has become our most active, and some of our leadership is here today. And they've been learning along. One of the leaders related to us in our diversity and inclusion panel the other day, the fact that they were really, the women's ERG was getting a lot of participation, but a group of women in that group came back and said, you're not managing this in a way that's inclusive. And they called a special session, totally changed the agenda. And so I'm sure that some of the women that brought that forth had been reluctant to bring forth in other settings. And so I was thinking, wow, that's a really powerful example of how an employee resource group, which was first and foremost created to help to give employees a sense of belonging and the attachment, has now provided a vehicle for women actually exercising leadership and taking charge and contributing to that culture. As I said, the word belonging has come up in a couple of the previous panels, and I think our employee resource groups are, the way they're organized, tend to be about people belonging to something. So I'm identifying as a Pacific Islander, and so we have a group that you can join. Or I want to join the Pride because I'm LGBTQIA. One of the lessons and the reflections I have, and Fiona asked us to think a little bit about intersectionality, is as I've looked and read about employee resource groups, I see somewhat of an evolution in them. And it was interesting, the corporate executive board that brings together a large number of corporations, they now created, most recently, a mosaic ERG, affinity group. And I was wondering, like, in trying to, things that are bubbling up from sort of, we have a group Pride, we have women's, we have Parents Network, but do we need to evolve our ERGs to try to break down silos and to permit that intersectionality in our employee affinity groups? I go beyond that with the ERGs, and I was talking, our human resources director and I were talking the other day that the ERGs are also an important venue for individuals to develop and demonstrate leadership skills. So from my vantage point as the COO of FHI 360, I come in touch with typically people that are in leadership roles. They're the directors, they're the team leads, the coach, as Gary would say. But it's really hard for me in a 5,500 person organization to get to know a lot of individuals. Well, I come in touch with the leaders of the ERG. I'm an executive sponsor of the Pride 360 ERG, and we meet regularly, and so I get exposed to individuals who I wouldn't normally get exposed to in the course of my work. So they have access to decision makers that they don't have. They set agendas. We give them the latitude to set agendas. We give them some latitude to allocate resources and to engage with senior managers. So they're all ventures. They're all venues for demonstrating and developing leadership. We have our Toastmasters group has evolved to FHI figure of speech, and they have developed and used their budget to develop training materials to support people in terms of making public presentations and overcome that. And I hearken back to Anne Marie's comment today about you can lead at any age or stage. And I think our employee research groups are really venues for enabling people to lead at any stage or at any age. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Debbie. I think that's so helpful to hear the role that ERGs play both for the individuals who are members of them, but also the advantages that offers to executive leadership. Thanks so much. Okay, Sumit, would love to hear about the journey of inclusive leadership that you're leading at SAVE.
Great. And Debbie, I must say that there's a lot of learning I just took, and I think other Save the Children leaders, in the room have taken with respect to what we're doing with our what we call EAGs, that we can take from your remarks. So thank you for that. So what I wanted to share with the group that'll be kind of reflected in my comments is really what's critical, from our perspective, is really kind of setting up the organizational mechanisms, the organizational structures in place so that we're addressing this work on gender and diversity and inclusion generally in a systematic way that lives in the life of the organization over time, as opposed to being addressed in a one-off sort of way where these changes, won't end up sticking. So we'll talk a little bit first about our gender equality work, and then I'll turn a little bit to our diversity and inclusion work more broadly. And a key aspect of what I want to mention too, in addition to the structures and the mechanisms in place, is that it has to be a team effort throughout your organization. There's no one individual that's going to move forward the gender work or diversity and inclusion work generally on their own. The CEO obviously is a critical person to have their support throughout any of this work, but the CEO can't move this forward on its own. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. So first of all, with respect to gender equality. So some of you may not know, but Save the Children is celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. Save the Children was, yes, thank you. So Save the Children was founded by an amazing woman named Eglantine Jebb, who is an advocate, a suffragist, and a human rights defender. And she founded this organization that was committed to defending the rights of children. So you fast forward 100 years now, we're an organization that is populated more than 80% by staff who are women, and also we have a senior management team, the majority of whom are composed by women. But we're also an organization that has, where staff have experienced the experiences that I spoke about earlier in my remarks. So it's far from an organization where we can say, just by virtue of having some positive statistics, so to speak, that everything is okay. It's far from it, and things need to be addressed. And so that's why really the importance of understanding that despite the fact that we have a large population of women as well as senior management team members who are women, there were so many of our female colleagues were experiencing the organization in a different way than their male counterparts. So what are we doing about it? So first of all, we've dedicated an important role, a senior role in the organization to gender equality. We have an AVP position of gender equality, and it's really focusing a lot on our programmatic work, because obviously that is really key in our programs work. But at the same time, gender is very key, within our organizational internal policies and procedures, because we view it as all very connected. So we are incredibly lucky that position is filled now by Yeva Avakian, who is a leader for us in this space and who has really exercised a lot of influence in the organization already and will continue to do so over time. So we've launched under Yeva's leadership, along with the support of our CEO, Carolyn Miles, a gender equality strategy. It's focusing on things like increasing our programs and our advocacy work with respect to addressing the gender power imbalance, really also looking at preventing and responding to gender-based violence, and just more generally, empowering women and girls. So that's programmatic, but at the same time, like I say, we take what we call a very inside-out approach, because what happens in the organization, we feel strongly, is very linked to what we do programmatically. So we've certainly been looking at our internal policies and procedures and culture, with respect to gender equality in the organization. And a real leader in that space is our Chief Human Resources Officer, who's also here with us today, Debbie Pollock-Berry. And a couple of specific things that I can mention that we've done internal in the organization for our staff is increasing our parental leave, as well as really identifying the gender pay gap and really driving our managers to close that gap. So certainly, we have a ways to go, but we're dedicated and we're setting up the mechanisms to address these things. And one of those mechanisms is having a gender equality hub, which is a cross-functional team that really looks at driving for the implementation of our strategy. Just to touch very briefly on our broader diversity and inclusion efforts, last year, at this time last year, in May of last year, we stood up an agency, Diversity and Inclusion Council, really looking at adjusting our organization to systematically build a diverse organization of individuals who feel that they're treated fairly, diverse workforce, individuals who they're fairly treated with respect and made visible in the work that they do for the organization. So we have a few different working groups, which I won't take the time today in the interest of time to go into detail about, but we have an employee involvement group, a workforce group, and a culture group, and really addressing this systematically through this in partnership with our human resources group. And I'm especially proud of our culture group that recently finalized a 3-year diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that we haven't even been able to launch yet in the agency because it's just hot off the presses, but we will launch it in the agency next month. But we have copies of it for you all here today, just if there's any help that we can give to you in terms of what we're looking at with respect to DEI across our organization.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that. Bonnie, would love to hear what you're leading within USAID. I know there was some exciting news recently about looking at the USAID Biodata Forum, which we're all very familiar with. So if as part of your remarks you could touch on that, because a very interested audience.
I wasn't planning to talk on that.
Oh, okay.
But I can if you want to. What I was going to talk to you guys about a little bit was our leadership philosophy and the concept at USAID, 11,000 staff members in around 100 countries around the world. It is an extremely diverse workforce. And one of the things that we've fostered at USAID is this concept that everyone is a leader. This is very different from the concept in the suburbs that everyone gets a trophy. It really is an empowerment. And it's designed to have everybody understand not just that they're a leader, but there are certain leadership requirements that really are expected and incumbent on everyone. And one of the areas where we see this playing out, I actually was just speaking about this morning on Capitol Hill, and that's the Administrators Action Alliance to Prevent Sexual Misconduct. And it's a subject that no one ever really wants to talk about, but that everybody is very aware of, and that maybe came to light a little bit in our world, our writ large, with the Me Too movement, but it's been around for a lot longer. And our Action Alliance to Prevent Sexual Misconduct has 2 work streams. I'm only going to talk about one of them. So the one I'm not going to talk about is preventing sexual misconduct in our own internal USAID workplace. And anyone who's here from USAID, I'm happy to talk with you about that offline. But really an extremely significant part of the work that we do everywhere in the world is focusing on some of the world's most vulnerable populations. The recipients and beneficiaries of USAID assistance and development programs are people who are vulnerable. The issue came to light on the front pages a year ago, a little over a year ago, when there was a scandal involving Oxfam and sexual exploitation of beneficiaries. But this is something that unfortunately has been an ongoing problem, probably since mankind began. Certainly I've seen it over the course of my career, whether it's from war, or from peacekeeping, or from any number of circumstances that people find themselves in. And USAID said, you know what, it's time for us to institutionalize a program that focuses on the most vulnerable populations and preventing sexual exploitation and abuse of our aid beneficiaries. It's something that we've seen over the years, probably more so in the humanitarian and crisis responses than we have in the day-to-day development work. But the reason that I link that in with our leadership philosophy is that we've empowered USAID staff all over the world to say, hey, this is not right. This is something that has to change, and reporting it. Significantly, too, though, I'm so happy to be on this panel with some of our most important implementing partners, both on the business, contracting, as well as on the nonprofit NGO side of the house. We have worked extremely closely with our implementing partners as well to have them take this philosophy of everybody being a leader in calling out sexual abuse and exploitation in aid programs around the world. I'm personally very seized with this issue, and I'm so proud of the progress that we've made in the course of this 1 year's time since we stood up this Action Alliance, but also of where we'll be taking that in the future and how important it is for some of the world's most vulnerable people. So that's what I was going to talk about.
Okay, well, Bonnie, that's extremely important, and thank you so much for highlighting that. Would you like to add anything about
The biodata.
the biodata sheets?
I'm not as familiar with those as I am with the Action Alliance. I think what you're referring to is the requirements of years of experience and all of that, past salary history. Okay, I am familiar with this. We're restructuring this because this is an area that impacts traditionally a lot of women. Women sometimes take time off from work to start their families. As a result, they have a break in their salary history. They come back and they're less competitive than men when it comes to earnings in the workplace. We're adjusting our biodata sheets for grants and contracts so that that is not playing a significant role anymore when it comes to past performances. There are a number of other things that we're looking at and taking into account to allow for equity across the gender gap and the equity pay divide. But that's us getting with the 21st century, I would say.
Thanks very much, Bonnie. Two really important topics. Thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. Oh gosh, did I do it again? All right, sorry. No, I just wanted to second everyone's thoughts that it's great to hear about what our peer organizations are doing, because I think Chemonics is definitely initiating ERGs and a Diversity and Inclusion Council. We certainly have so much to learn from one another. From Chemonics' perspective, I mean, diversity and inclusion has always been part of our values, a core part of who we are as a company, and I think we truly believe that it makes us stronger and serves as sort of an engine for innovation to really position us to provide the best development solutions that we can. But what I'm proud to say is that, you know, we have really taken the deliberate action to move beyond just sort of our belief system and think about sort of thoughtful, deliberate actions that we can engage in as a company to really address diversity and inclusion. And for us, I think that really started with an important period of self-reflection as a company, where Chemonics initiated an organizational diversity and inclusion assessment. This was initiated by an external consultant where we looked at our policies, procedures, and importantly, our culture. we engaged and asked for honest feedback from, a cross-section of our staff through focus groups. We surveyed our global workforce, and really, I think we're looking to hear the answers to the questions of, do we feel included in our job? What type of environment are we creating for diversity and inclusion? What are we doing well, and what are we not doing so well? And I think that analysis really helped us to sort of devise our strategy and roadmap of how we were going to design our initiatives to approach diversity and inclusion. For us, that included hiring a corporate diversity and inclusion director who reports directly to the CEO and is helping us sort of guide this journey. And I think one of sort of the key findings that we found was looking at the gender balance in senior leadership. And it really prompted us to sort of, I think, take thoughtful and deliberate action again in that issue of succession planning. How can we get ready a pipeline of leaders in the organization who are ready to assume executive positions? How can we be openly discussing challenges that people might feel about adopting those roles? Issues of flexibility and work-life balance that are so critical to people thinking about those leadership roles. And I think we've also sort of more broadly looked at how to engage women and kind of create the space for women across the organization to engage with the leadership, understanding, what are different pathways to leadership that people have experienced. Last month, we hosted a speed mentoring event where people were able to sort of engage with women leaders and learn different tidbits about sort of how they were approaching different elements of their work. And so I think those are the types of initiatives that we've undertaken. We're certainly not only focused on gender. We're committed to creating an inclusive environment more broadly, to kind of equipping our staff with the skills to engage across differences. A critical element for that has been our employee-led Honoring Our Differences program, where we've really tried to create the space for people from different groups to have an honest dialogue, share their own personal stories, and just sort of create that space for engagement. And I would just also add that for us, importantly, 80% of our workforce is outside of the US. So thinking about diversity and inclusion really is a critical consideration in our field offices as well. And one way in which we've work to do that is through our gender equality and social inclusion assessment and action plans that are often developed at sort of an initial juncture of the program. And it's provided us an opportunity to really look at the makeup and configuration of our field offices. Of course, we're all familiar that we work across so many different country and cultural contexts where diversity and inclusion means a very different thing in each place in which we work. So really being thoughtful about, understanding the women representation at different levels of the organization, social representation of different groups, people with disabilities, religious minorities, and, really understanding and prioritizing that in order for us to be doing effective development work, we need to kind of walk the talk, as others were saying, within our own teams, and working with our field leadership to kind of embrace those ideals with across all of our teams and all of our offices. So for us, I think a critical phase has been that sort of reflection and assessment period, both in the home office and across all of our offices, to help us really design tailored initiatives that address the organization's needs.
Okay. Excellent, Catherine. Thanks so much for sharing that. Over to you, Sylvia.
Thank you very much. So one of the things that we were talking about in preparation for this panel is one of the issues about leadership is making sure that we can, I believe, demonstrate transparency and fairness across the entire organization, and that's something that's very important to me. One of the ways we do that, as we talked about earlier, is trying and doing our best to ensuring pay equity across the organization, both for men and for women, but for all different kinds of representatives of our staff. I joined HDI Voca in December of 2016, and we have actually a very new leadership team. So we're at an extremely exciting time of the organization because we can really take the time now to show our teams and our staff how we want them to show up as leaders and how we want to model effective leadership within the organization. When I joined on December 16th, and 3 weeks later, I had to sit on a small compensation panel and help, led by our HR department, help make decisions across the entire organization about the salaries that our staff and the increases that we would be getting, which was extremely daunting. And it was daunting because it's something that I take extremely seriously. So I spent the first couple of weeks getting to know my teams, asking as much as I could, but I really wasn't in a position to evaluate, in essence, a lot of the recommendations. But that was interesting because I could have a different view to it. I could ask some tough questions and be using the data that I was given. Our process is one where HR really goes through and does a salary assessment across our industry using many different surveys, taking many different lenses to it, comparing it to our salary scales, and then evaluating where our staff are in that scales so that they can come to the meeting with some recommendations what they think we ought to do. At that first meeting, one of the things, though, that I felt I wanted us to talk about is what are the principles upon which we are making these decisions, and can we articulate those principles to our staff? And that is really important to me. And every decision that we made, I said, how does that fit into these principles? Well, this person, no. I have to be comfortable standing up and standing by those principles. So in fact, this year, we had a change in CEO. And this year, for the first time, we didn't do it perfectly, but I still think we did something that was important to us, is when we let people know what the salary scales were, we told them specifically what those principles were. And that transparency is really, really quite important to me. I mean, I think what we heard earlier today, what Vivian was saying, all the data is out there. We know the importance of having equity in salary, but how is it more than 50 years since the laws have been passed about pay fairness, it's still not fair. So we're taking a lot of steps to do that. We announced last month that going forward, starting probably the beginning of the third quarter this year, we will no longer be asking for salary history for any staff who are joining our headquarters. I wish I could say starting tomorrow, and it's frustrating, I can't say starting tomorrow, but we have to do this right. And doing this right means a lot of things. We need to make sure that we do having an audit and an external evaluation of our pay scales and our salaries and an evaluation of our staff along with many different lenses to make sure that I feel that we are living up to the standards that we need. We then need to make sure we understand how we're going to be setting salaries for positions. And we also need to do training of our staff and our managers. So while it sounds like a simple thing, I want to be deliberate in the way that we go about this. I think I mentioned we're in a really exciting time in the organization, and that's because with a newer leadership team, we're rolling out a new strategy, an updated vision and mission, and something that I'll say I was a little disappointed when I joined HDI Voca is I didn't feel like we certainly didn't have them written down, clearly articulated values. And I needed those values to hang my hat on because I want to emulate the behavior that I expect people at all levels to show. So after we went through and redid our mission and our vision, we worked with staff, and staff felt included and their voices were heard as we identified what were the values that were important to us. And that includes passion, insight, resilience, impact, respect, and integrity. And now when staff talk to me or hear from me, and I talk to our leadership and others, my peers, my own boss, I ask, how are we living these values? We have a long way to go, but this is just being rolled out now. So this is going to be a fascinating and interesting journey, but an exciting one for us.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking about the work you're doing around salary equity and also talking about setting values and culture within the company. Catherine, I love the reflection you had a moment ago that between what all the speakers have shared, we actually have a great kind of basket of hearing about the kinds of issues and priorities that many organizations in our sector are considering: the salary equity, prevention of sexual exploitation, gender equality strategies, ERGs, and of course setting culture. So Catherine, you had said, we have a lot to learn from each other. In fact, I think we heard that from Sumit as well. So I'm going to invite the panelists to just ask a couple of questions of one another now. So what would you like to delve into? What did you hear that you're curious about that you would like to know more about? Go ahead, Debbie.
Sumit, this is for you. You mentioned that you had a culture group. And I was interested in what is that about? Like, as part of your Diversity Inclusion Council, it's a subset, or just a little bit more about, is it assessing the culture developing, or what's it going to do?
Yes. So, candid answer, and that is that we are figuring it out over time because it is kind of more amorphous than the other two groups. The topic is more amorphous than the other two groups that we have on the council, the workforce group and then the employee involvement group. But we're not allowing ourselves just to fall back on that excuse that it is more amorphous, which is why that culture group took on actually what ended up being quite a daunting and actually a critical task, which is to develop the overall strategy. So what we decided to do was take the last several months for that group to really lead among the council, and then in communication with staff to develop the overall strategy, and then they socialized it with the senior management team, and then it recently was approved. So there will be things like trainings, things that they will focus on, but I think what we really need to turn to now is, when we have a strategy, now develop the work plan where each of the working groups will deliver under that. But one thing I did want to touch on, though, is that I think you especially mentioned it, with respect to the values process, in terms of coming up with the values and then having an inclusive process with staff. And I love hearing that. And one thing that really that reminds me of within our organization is that when we went out and had several sessions with staff to talk about what's important to you with respect to diversity and inclusion, because it's broad, right? And it's important to understand that each organization, the specific initiatives that would be undertaken, should really be fed into by staff. And one thing that we learned in part of the culture group by kind of facilitating these sessions is that the house was relatively on fire with what staff thought management was doing in terms of the wrong thing by not paying our interns. So management, we weren't as attuned to that issue. It had popped up over time, but by having but by having these sessions, we realized this was something significant to staff. And so what we did by having those inclusive sessions is we realized this is significant. We need to focus on this right away. So we had one of the groups of the council, the employee involved, the workforce group, which and the interns are an important part of the workforce. And as we talked about in other sessions today, that's a key entry point into the workforce, right? So we made a business case to my colleagues on the senior management team to pay our interns. Business reasons, social justice reasons, diversity reasons, and recently it was approved by the senior management team. So in the fall, we actually will be paying our interns. So just wanted to mention the importance of an inclusive process.
Debbie, you talked about how your employee working groups, you had to do a reset because they realized that they weren't in fact being inclusive. And can you talk a little bit about how now you do make sure that those working groups are inclusive, what steps you take?
So again, there's not a reset per se. It was sort of a reflection of my own as I thought about them. And it's interesting, the life of an affinity group. So they're very much driven, they're volunteers leading these who are looking for, who've agreed to step up and take a leadership role. And in a couple of our groups, we started to see them falter. And there wasn't the participation, and so as an executive sponsor, I would have to sit down and talk to them about what could we do differently, why aren't people joining, particularly as with our Pride 360 group, we just weren't getting the lift. It was becoming a very siloed, and the leaders of those groups had felt that they had been the leaders for years and years and years, and nobody else was stepping up to the plate. And so I'm like, how do I support this group? And then we had a change in leadership in our DC office, and that group is really taking on, but it was sort of a reflection that the groups, because of the leadership and the volunteer leadership, they're going to evolve. And as I've tried to think about ways to get our ERGs to work together, because it's about belonging, increased recognition of intersectionality, of the need to recognize that we can be exclusive even when we're trying to be inclusive. And so it's more my reflection that do we need to evolve even further? And how do you do that? You don't want to be driven by the top, but we need to create the policies that allow people to say, hey, maybe we should try to do it this way or infuse a different set of ideas.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bonnie, you've worked in a lot of diverse organizations over your career. What advice do you have for us as a mid-level career person who wants to be gaining greater leadership opportunities, which could include kind of helping to shift or shape culture within an organization? What are 2 or 3 things that we can think about doing?
That's a great question, and it goes back to that point, I would say, that my first boss at IBM made to me, that I was a square peg in a round hole. I think what's really important is to embrace your strengths. Everybody is bringing something to the table, and whatever it is that you're bringing to the table has value. And I think that that's something that if you're comfortable with what you're bringing to the table, you should be comfortable articulating it. And one of the things, I presume everyone has read Lean In, but what I try to live in terms of values is inclusiveness. And just this morning, as I said, I was doing a briefing on the Hill, and there were seats at the table, and there were a bunch of staffers who were sitting off to the side. And it's so easy to say, why don't you come and sit with us? Because we value your opinions and we value your questions, and maybe you'll be nicer to me when you're grilling me. But I think it's something that sends a message to everyone that when you're inclusive rather than exclusive, I think you gain overall as a whole, and the whole institution improves.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bonnie. I think that is an excellent final word. So thank you all for sharing your journeys of inclusive leadership. I think we all took away a lot of concrete things we can think about. Thank you.